Morning, everybody. This is the Tuesday, February 12th work session of the Portland City Council. I want to thank everyone for being here. Today's subject is the Joint Terrorism Task Force. There's understandable and very reasonable questions around PPB's participation in the Joint Terrorism Task Force that need to be answered. 3 commissioners on this council, including myself, have never had the opportunity to vote on the city's partnership with the Joint Terrorism Task Force, so it makes sense that we'd have the opportunity to come together and talk about our participation, the various roles, the various expectations. I believe it behooves the council to have a thoughtful, deliberative, and collaborative discussion to debate the merits of the city's involvement in the JTTF with a complete understanding of the facts. First, we're going to have Tracy Reed, the city attorney, give us a contextual statement or a contextual presentation about the Joint Terrorism Task Force. I anticipate, Tracy, that's about 10 minutes, correct? We will then have a 30-minute panel presentation from 3 advocates in support of the city's withdrawal from the Joint Terrorism Task Force. That was organized by Commissioner Hardesty. That will be followed by a 30-minute panel in support of the city remaining in the partnership. Then the second half of the work session will be dedicated predominantly to Q&A, where commissioners will have the opportunity to ask questions of any panel members, including Chief Outlaw and the Portland Police Bureau's 2 JTTF officers named Matt and Brian. They will all be joining us by phone. PPB has asked that we not share the full names of the officers given their undercover work with the JTTF. So there'll be 30 minutes each side, 5 minutes then each for each commissioner to ask questions. My presumption is we'll have the opportunity to go through several times, but I just want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to ask their questions. So we'll have 5 minutes each, and I'll start with Commissioner Hardesty. So with that, Tracy, you're up.
So I've been asked to give a brief background on the history of the city's involvement with the Joint Terrorism Task Force. And I thought it would be useful background to give the legal definition of what we mean when we talk about domestic terrorism. So under the federal statute 18 U.S.C. 2331, domestic terrorism is defined as activities that involve acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the United States or of any state, and that appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. So with that legal framework, here's the timeline in a nutshell. This is quite abbreviated of the city's participation. So in 1997, Portland informally collaborated with the local JTTF at the direction of then Mayor Katz, who was also the police commissioner, to investigate potential threats to the Nike World Master Games. In 1998 and 2000, city council members formalized the relationship with the federal anti-terrorism efforts with a couple of ordinances approving agreements. In 2001, in the wake of the September 11 attacks, the City Council renewed the Joint Terrorism Task Force Memorandum of Understanding. In 2002, the memorandum was updated. In 2003, the City Council agreed to remain in the JTTF, but also joined more than 200 communities nationally that were expressing concerns about the USA Patriot Act and potential overreach by the federal government in response to the September 11th terror attacks. In 2005, with those concerns continuing, the city council members voted 4-1 to remove PPB officers as actual members of the JTTF and to establish protocols for cooperating with the FBI on terrorism investigations short of participating fully in the JTTF. In 2010, the FBI arrested the attempted car bomber at the Christmas tree lighting in Pioneer Square. And in 2011, the City Council considered whether to rejoin the Joint Terrorism Task Force, but decided at that time not to enter into a memorandum of understanding. The City Council instead elected to cooperate by assigning PPB officers to the JTTF on an as-needed basis. In 2015, the Council considered alternative proposals to terminate the prior as-needed cooperation with the JTTF or to enter into a new memorandum of understanding in which the city would again become a participant in the JTTF. Ultimately, at that time in 2015, the council decided to enter into a memorandum of understanding with the FBI to again become a full member of the JTTF, subject to certain safeguards and responsibilities on the part of various city actors that the council put in place. And I'm going to briefly go through those. The police commissioner has the responsibility under the current council direction and memorandum of understanding to receive classified briefings from the FBI special agent in charge pursuant to a non-disclosure agreement, and that's in lieu of a secret level clearance. And those briefings are to be on the progress of investigations within the city of Portland and the activities of the PPB officers assigned to the JTTF. The police commissioner also is to receive updates on activities of other FBI PPB collaborations and general trends in terrorist threats nationally. The chief of police has responsibilities as well to assign 2 PPB officers from the criminal investigations unit to the JTTF, to obtain a top secret clearance to ensure that the chief has access to the information necessary to supervise the PPB officers, to participate in the JTTF Executive Committee with other local chiefs and sheriffs, and to immediately notify the police commissioner of any report from any PPB officers that a violation of certain state statutes has occurred. And I'm going to touch on what those are in a moment. PPB officers are required to abide by all laws, regulations, policies, personnel rules applicable to their status as a PPB officer. So what this means in a nutshell is that participating in the JTTF does not in any way exempt any PPB officer from any state law, any city code, any PPB directive or SOP, standard operating procedure. The officers that are assigned are to work full-time with the JTTF under the day-to-day supervision of the FBI special agent in charge. They are directed to seek legal advice from the city attorney if there's any question regarding the applicability of any Oregon laws or local laws, and especially certain identified laws that, again, I'm going to touch on in just a moment. They are to notify the police chief and the FBI special agent in charge if they're ever asked to do any work that would be a violation of any Oregon or local laws. And again, there's special emphasis on a few state statutes. And they're to participate in annual training provided by the city attorney's office to ensure that they have the knowledge necessary to comply with those laws. The city attorney has certain responsibilities to consult with the police commissioner, the chief, and PPB officers when they have any concerns regarding the applicability of any state or local laws or city code or policies. If the city attorney believes it's necessary to access classified information in order to provide that advice, the city attorney is directed to obtain a non-disclosure agreement. To my knowledge, that has never been necessary to date. To provide annual training to PPB officers assigned to the JTTF to ensure, again, that they have the information they need to comply with the applicable laws and policies, and to confer with the Oregon AG to ensure that, that if there are any changes to state or federal laws that would preclude PPB officers from participating, that we become aware of that. And again, that has not to date occurred in that there's been no legal changes that would preclude participation. So I just wanted to briefly touch on the particular state statutes that council has identified as being of particular concern and has emphasized the need for PPB to comply with, including those officers assigned to the JTTF. ORS 181A250 is the statute that prohibits any local law enforcement agency in the state of Oregon, or any law enforcement agency in the state of Oregon, from collecting or maintaining information about political, religious, or social views on any individual or any group unless that information is directly related to an investigation of criminal activity that there is reasonable suspicion to believe has occurred or is ongoing. And ORS 181A820 is the state sanctuary law that prohibits any law enforcement agency in the state of Oregon from using public funds for the purpose of enforcing federal immigration laws. And of course, the city of Portland also has a sanctuary resolution that takes that further under city, binding city policy, and PPB has adopted directives that are compliant with those state laws. So those are the laws that, in particular, council has focused attention on, and when we do training, we also focus on those. And that, the only other thing I was going to mention is that there are additional PPB and FBI partnerships. This is a non-exhaustive list, but PPB also partners with the FBI on the Innocent Images Task Force, the Child Exploitation Task Force, the Northwest Regional Computer Forensics Lab, the Bank Robbery Task Force, and in other areas of law enforcement. So that's it. Carla has some additional copies of the presentation that you all have, which gives the specific ordinances and statutes that go through the history of this, if folks are interested. And I think Commissioner Fish indicated he'd be willing to post that on his website in case folks are interested in having that additional information as to what, over those last 20 years, the specific resolutions and ordinances have been where council has taken the different actions that it has with regard to the JTTF.
Thank you, Tracy. Very good summary. I appreciate that. So colleagues, again, I'm going to ask us to take notes, hold our questions. So write down who the questions are for so you don't forget. We're going to hear 30 minutes first from our panel advocating for withdrawal from the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Zara Ballou from CARE San Francisco, former FBI agent, and Brennan Center fellow Michael German, and Casey Jama from Unite Oregon. You have 30 minutes. Good morning. Welcome.
Good morning. I'll start. My name is Mike German. I'm a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice, and as you mentioned, was an FBI agent for 16 years. This is not the first time I've been here to Portland, so I appreciate being invited back. The issue I think that we're dealing with is law enforcement in a democratic society has a very difficult job. They are responsible for protecting our safety, but at the same time responsible for protecting us from unwarranted government intrusion. And that's where we need strong legal standards saying when they can do an investigation. And when I was an agent working on Joint Terrorism Task Forces, doing undercover work for the FBI, we had a standard reasonable indication that was very close to what the Oregon statute requires. And we have to remember these rules came up after a period of abuse of law enforcement intelligence authorities. And I found that that was a standard that actually helped me be very effective because it continually focused me where the evidence showed somebody was actually engaging in some kind of wrongdoing or planning to. After 9/11, however, the FBI started changing its rules, not just with the Patriot Act that governed some foreign intelligence collection, and later we found out was also being used to collect all of our telephone records. But more pertinent to this discussion, their investigative rules under the Attorney General guidelines. And those changed several times, but most significantly in 2008 when they created 3 separate kinds of investigations. An assessment, which can be opened by an agent for the first 30 days without supervisory approval, at least on the paper. I don't know what happens in real life, requires no factual predicate. All it requires is an agent saying to themselves that they have an authorized purpose. So if they say, my purpose is to prevent crime or to prevent terrorism, they can then do a very intrusive type of investigation that involves recruiting and tasking informants, collecting data from commercial and government databases, there actually is a document called the Baseline Collection Plan that lists all the type of information they expect agents to collect during this investigation that, again, requires no factual predicate, no reason to believe you're doing anything wrong. In fact, they can open an assessment to determine if you would be suitable as an informant. So not even that you're doing anything wrong, but that you might know somebody. And this information all gets collected by the FBI into their databases. Preliminary investigation is the second stage that requires information or an allegation. When the ACLU obtained FOIA records showing that the Joint Terrorism Task Forces in the early 2000s were targeting domestic advocacy groups, the Inspector General did a audit of those investigations and found that often the agents were making their own allegations and speculating about potential future harm, which of course covers all of us. All of us are potentially future harm. So the fact that these two types of investigations are collecting intelligence would put the Portland Police's access to that information in violation of their own statute. So it's not disaggregated, it's only full investigations that require anything close to the reasonable suspicion standard in Oregon law. And I have previous testimony that explains this and points out some abuses, but just last week, The Guardian wrote an article about an investigation in San Francisco that I thought was pertinent because it's actually a full investigation. But what it shows is that the FBI is not following its own rules, because there's two problems, right? You can have very good standards, but if you don't have independent oversight and public accountability, whether those standards are followed in the breach is impossible to answer until you get records like this. And this document got a lot of attention because it was talking about a white supremacist riot in Sacramento in 2016 that it was being used, that the FBI was using to justify an investigation against anti-racist protesters who came to confront the racists that had gone to protest. And it describes the Ku Klux Klan as consisting of members that some perceive to be supportive of a white supremacist group. So the idea that the description of the Ku Klux Klan as the victims rather than as perpetrators. And immediately in the next paragraph, it shifts to a passive voice where it says violence broke out and people were stabbed without identifying that it was actually the white supremacists who were the ones who stabbed and the anti-racist protesters were the ones who got stabbed, which would have changed whether they were investigating the anti-racist protesters or the white supremacists. And this is problematic because the Ku Klux Klan was not at this rally. So it's not even factually correct. And yet this type of investigation is what the FBI calls a sensitive investigative circumstance, which means that this requires the highest level of internal oversight. And as you can see from the documents, and I passed around copies last night, so I apologize for getting them to you late, but I can go over them with you as you like. It's approved by a chief division counsel, which is the highest lawyer in the FBI. So this document should be a warning that even with that highest level of oversight, poor investigations can be approved that justify investigating people who shouldn't be investigated. Another sensitive circumstance is what they call an academic nexus. And the documents that were released by a group called Property of the People through FOIA, who obtained them through FOIA, show that there was investigation of this anti-racist group on the University of Berkeley campus. So again, this is the type of investigation that the internal rules are supposed to prevent from happening, and yet in the breach they don't. And two key parts of it are that in describing the predication for justifying a full investigation, it says that some in this group had been engaged in activities such as refusing to disperse, trespassing in closed buildings, obstructing law enforcement, and shouting and interrupting during public meetings. And the IG in the earlier investigation I mentioned criticized the FBI for using that kind of civil disobedience to justify opening terrorism investigations. And obviously they haven't responded to that criticism. And I just point out one last piece where it says, concluding to justify the investigation, based on the alleged actions of this group, And again, allegations are supposed to open a preliminary investigation, not a full investigation. And then it says it's possible that certain members may exceed the boundaries of the law. Again, that's true of all of us, but this standard is supposed to be for the full investigation requiring a reasonable indication. So let me end there and move to them. But I think one of the things we have to keep in mind is, and why I appreciate the City of Portland so much in working on this, is this isn't, do we want to be friends with the FBI? Do we not want to be friends with the FBI? This is about making sure that there are strong standards. And if by withdrawing from the task force, we can encourage the FBI and the Justice Department to increase their standards to a reasonable standard, I think that would benefit all of us and keep all of us safe.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning, Mayor Wheeler, Commissioners. My name is Zahra Bilou. I am here for this important conversation and so grateful to you for convening it. I speak as the Executive Director of the San Francisco Bay Area Office of CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. We're the nation's largest Muslim civil rights organization, where I've served now for nearly 10 years. As a daughter of immigrants and a young civil rights attorney, I fell into my experiences and encounters with FBI and law enforcement targeting of members of the Muslim community inadvertently. I will always remember the first call I got asking for help in early 2010. There are FBI agents at my door. I don't know what to do. Well, tell them that you will have your attorney call them. And that interaction, over hundreds of instances for our office in the last 10 years, has resulted in a number of responses. Why do you have an attorney? Where did you get your attorney? Who is paying for your attorney? What do you have to hide? If you make us go away, we'll come back with a warrant and then it won't be so pleasant. Not leaving when people ask them to leave. Continuing to call our clients directly after attorneys have called the agents. And then the attorneys having the experience of being told, we can't talk to you. We can't tell you what we want from your client. Why are you getting involved in this? Over and over again, undermining everything that I learned about what it meant to be a lawyer for the people. People in need, people who didn't always speak English, people who were otherwise targeted, and now people who often see themselves demonized through language coming from the federal government. And so when I learned about the Joint Terrorism Task Force and San Francisco and Oakland and so many other Bay Area cities' participation in it, I was further concerned, because who does our community call when we experience a hate crime? The local police. What we started to hear from members of the Muslim community was that we are afraid to call the local police because we see that they cooperate with the FBI. We see that they have officers placed in the Joint Terrorism Task Force who are not cooperating with local laws, who are not subject to the stricter standards that San Francisco and so many other cities have put in place, like Portland. And so we actually looked at Portland as an example when Portland wasn't in the Joint Terrorism Task Force to say, look, we can be a city that is safe, that embraces the values that we pride ourselves on, that keeps its promise to its communities, and still interacts with federal law enforcement as needed on a very limited case-by-case basis, ensuring that our full-time officers are not being utilized for abuses in our own community. And so in San Francisco and in Oakland now, both cities we've looked at, in San Francisco, we passed legislation requiring that the officers participating in the Joint Terrorism Task Force participate in regular, thorough, transparent report backs. Year after year, we fought over the reports. The first year, the year that we expected a 5-year campaign to give us the best report with the most information, under different political circumstances than we are in today, we got a 3-minute verbal report back at a police commission hearing. No rights were violated, nothing to report back, all's great. The challenge, however, was we had clients who were still being visited by local police officers under the guise of working with the Joint Terrorism Task Force. The most public example of this, of course, is Sarmad Jilani, an engineer at Google, who did the thing of visiting his home country, Pakistan, and blogging about what he saw. Comes into work one day and is told by his aides at Google that law enforcement is there to speak with him. and it is a member of the San Francisco Police Department and a member of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, a member of the FBI, both through the Joint Terrorism Task Force, who want to see him at his workplace, his professional workplace at a major tech company, who've told his employer that they are with the Joint Terrorism Task Force and now want to ask him about what he blogs about and what he saw in Pakistan. And could he report back on what he saw in Pakistan the next time he comes through the border? Can you imagine that experience? That started the conversation of how it was impossible for SFPD to participate in the Joint Terrorism Task Force because the FBI wouldn't provide the transparency that we needed and continued to put these police officers in a position where they were violating the rights of our community members, right? Engaging in ongoing harassment that made everyone afraid to call local police for help ever. Eventually, thankfully, San Francisco withdrew from the Joint Terrorism Task Force last year. We're still safe. Nothing has happened. The police can continue to do their job. If the FBI is refusing to provide information that is necessary to keep San Francisco safe because of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, then that's an FBI problem. That's them not doing their job. That's them holding the city hostage and putting everyone in danger. But the cost of our safety should never have to be our community members' rights. I checked in with our advocates in Oakland this morning on my way here. You'll be interested to know that we got our first JTTF report there last week also. And members of the Oakland Privacy Commission have already stated for the record that the report is disappointing, that it's vague, that it's not transparent, and that it in no way helps members of Oakland leadership understand whether or not the police officers there are actually cooperating with local, or actually following and adhering to local law, or cooperating with the FBI at the cost of local citizens' rights. I urge all of you to be the leader that we looked at when we started to explore these questions in San Francisco and to move forward with withdrawing from the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force.
Good morning, Mayor Wheeler and member of City Commissioners. My name is Casey Chama. Thank you for inviting me here to speak today. For the record, my name is Casey Chama. I'm the Executive Director of Unite Oregon, a statewide organization dedicated...
Excuse me, Casey, could you move your mic closer?
A statewide organization dedicated to build a unified intercultural movement for racial and social justice. My perspective comes from 20 years of deep community engagement with immigrants and refugees and Muslims in Portland. In fact, I have spoken many of them about the JTTF decisions. And while they agree in this position, they remain afraid to speak out. We're here today with a simple message. Portland is better off without the Joint Terrorist Task Force. And I urge you to withdraw us from this federal partnership immediately. I don't need to remind you that we have been here before. This is at least my third debate about Portland's participation on JTTF since 2004. But the fundamental issue have not been changed. Participation on the JTTF does not give the Portland Police Chief, Portland Commissioner, Police Commissioner, the City Attorney, or any other local official meaningful oversight of officers' activities. There is no guarantee that local officials will be granted the security clearance that will allow them to see what JTTF assigned officers are up to. As you all well know, we already have trouble holding law enforcement accountable in Portland. We would not continue to partnership that further undermines accountable policing in our community. Let's remember that just this past November, voters across the country defeated Measure 105, which would have repealed the state's 30-year-old sanctuary status. During the past Bush era, our sanctuary status protected Muslims from special registration and cooperation with the administration's civil rights violation of my community. You stood with us against Measure 105. We heard nothing from the FBI in that matter. Supporters of the participation of the JTTF have urged the community to simply take in faith that JTTF assigned officers are complying with the state anti-profiling and surveillance law. But without public oversight of JTTF activities by civilian officials, How can we, our community, afford to take that leap of faith? I respect Commissioner Fish to try to address this in one of his proposal amendments, but I do not believe we can afford to take federal law enforcement agencies at their word. And it would be a mistake to think that we can dictate terms of federal program that federal agencies running it. Finally, let's address the elephant in the room, the Trump administration. This administration has encouraged profiling, harassment, and tracking activities like those who involved in Black Lives Matter movement or those who are protesting the administration's action. And the reality is that ICE is the largest partner at the JTTF activity nationally. The administration has issued federal law enforcement to target Muslims, immigrants, refugees, and other vulnerable members of our community. Continuing to participate, the JTTF makes this complicit in the Trump administration's deportation regime. And it flies in the face of our commitment to be a sanctuary city for those who are Donald Trump's crosshairs. If you are serious about the city serving as a sanctuary city for our vulnerable community, you must withdraw from the JTTF. Mayor, commissioners, I am thankful that we are having the opportunity to discuss this program. And I applaud Commissioner Harris for getting us to this point. But at the same time, I'm tired. I'm tired of repeating the same argument for the decade and a half when underlying issues have not changed. I'm tired of pretending that somehow, some way, things are going to be different this time around. And I'm tired of this cities paying lip service to the idea of being sanctuary city without actual commitment to make sanctuary status reality for our vulnerable community. Let's stand up together for justice. Let's stand up together for communities who need our support in the dark times. I urge you withdraw from the JTTF immediately. I thank you for the opportunity to speak in front of you. And finally, I have, as I said, I've been working in this community for many years. The same issue that has been raised in San Francisco, how immigrant refugees, particularly those who are from Muslim background, are dealt with by the FBI investigation, it still applies to Portland. Many community is very fearful by simply just getting a knock at their door. And that's the message that I have been hearing from them, that they are absolutely terrified, even to come to this hearing like this and to discuss about this issue. Again, thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mayor. We look like we have about 10 minutes left. May I bring up another speaker?
You may.
Brandon Mayfield, would you come up, please, and provide testimony? Thank you. Be kind enough to share your microphone.
Can everybody hear me?
Turn it on.
Now can everybody hear me? Good morning. Assalamu alaikum. I want to thank the mayor and the commissioners for giving us an opportunity, for me also an opportunity to share with you some of my concerns and experiences regarding the JTTF. There are several reasons why I believe we should get out of the JTTF. And for example, there's the framers of our Constitution, both originally and in this state, adhered to an idea of
Mayfield, I'm
federalism.
sorry, that microphone's acting. Maybe just slide it a little bit farther away. Sorry.
So the reason why we have federalism is to protect people's civil liberties, so you don't have power that is concentrated in one group, say executive versus legislator, and also federal versus state. And the JTTF is increasing control of local law enforcement officers through to achieve the goals of the federal government, which, as our other panelists have shared with you, since 2001, targets ethnic minorities, Muslims, and Arabs. And And I think those goals are not consistent with the city of Portland and the state of Oregon. And I just wanted to correct the city attorney who gave that wonderful overview. I think she said, according to our ORS 181-820, that we're not to use funds that assist in immigration enforcement. And it's actually, we're not supposed to use personnel as well. And this is a big problem I have with our participation in the JTTF. That is, you're using Portland police officers, personnel, that are sitting with a joint terrorism task force that includes immigration and custom enforcement. And that is contrary to, I know it's an inconvenient truth, but that's contrary to our Oregon sanctuary law that's been in place for 30 years. And additionally, it's inconsistent with ORS 181, I believe 575, which is our anti-profiling law. And that law says you cannot collect information, you cannot maintain information based on an individual's ethnic background, religion, political activism, etc. And I've heard people say, well, the Portland JTTF has never violated these laws. And again, as Casey said, he's been here for 3 different panels. And I've been here for at least 3 different panels. And I keep saying again and again that yes, the Portland JTTF has violated this law. I can give you a specific example. In my case, I was arrested in connection with the 2004 Madrid, Spain bombing. I was arrested in May 6, 2004. But before that, there was an investigation that involved Portland JTTF members and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And one day in April, I have a log, an investigative log that shows the FBI tracking me leaving my house in my red maroon car with another suspect, came back, pulled something out of my trunk. And what was that suspicious thing that I pulled out of my trunk? It was a basketball and a basketball hoop. And who was that other suspicious occupant? It was my 15-year-old son, Shane. But that's not the important part. The important part is that investigative log stops and it picks up with a Portland JTTF member who is casing our local mosque, the Beaverton Mosque, my coming and going at the mosque. And the important thing to bear in mind is Beth Steele from the FBI, the day before I was arrested, in an email that was formally classified but has been released, said they didn't have probable cause that I had committed a crime. And therefore, the biggest problem we have with the JTTF, it won't be corrected by having an amendment that allows the mayor, the police chief, a secret clearance, because those officers, as long as they're still conducting those kind of investigations where you are casing local area Muslims like myself, my friends, my family, you are violating Oregon sanctuary law. And bear in mind, it was just a year ago that the former U.S. Attorney, Jeff Sessions, threatened to withdraw federal funding if Portland became a sanctuary city. And what did Portland do? They became a sanctuary city. The federal government, since 2001, has historically spent approximately $80 billion a year in counterterrorism and intelligence. And prior to that, they spent about $27 billion a year. So do we really need to allow, to give? What this is, it's a carrot and stick. We have all the sticks being presented by the Attorney General and no carrots. What are we getting in return? You're violating our civil rights and you are giving free personnel where it could be used otherwise. So I would just remind you what Tom Potter had said back in 2005 when he wanted to have further oversight and take a careful, detailed look at what the JTTF was doing. And he said, it doesn't matter whether we stay in the JTTF or get out of the JTTF. That's not what will make us safer. It's only when we start caring for each other and supporting each other that it'll make us safer. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thanks to the whole panel. Thank you in particular for those of you who traveled to be here. We appreciate it very much. The second panel will be Stephen Reichard from the Citizens Crime Commission, Chief Outlaw, who will be appearing by video, U.S. Attorney for Oregon, Billy Williams, FBI Supervisory Special Agent Jessica Anderson, and Assistant U.S. Attorney Ethan Knight. We'll start off with Mr. Reichard.
Good morning, Mayor Wheeler and City Council Commissioners. My name is Stephen Reichard. I'm the Interim Executive Director of the Citizens Crime Commission. Thank you for this opportunity to share with you our view about the city's role and responsibility in combating terrorism. I'm testifying today on behalf of members of the Citizens Crime Commission, and frankly, I was a little reluctant to testify, as Nicole Grant, the Mayor's Senior Policy Advisor, can attest. My father was investigated by the FBI and eventually hauled before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1959, 6 months before I was born, as a consequence of having been offered a teaching position at J. Edgar Hoover's alma mater, George Washington. He took the fifth, and he lost his job. I have spent the bulk of my professional career working on behalf of the least of us, those whom society has marginalized and targeted. And while Ray Mathis, a former executive director of the Crime Commission and a former FBI officer, told me if I had $1 for everyone who says that they have an FBI record but don't, I'd be a wealthy man, I suspect that I do, in fact, have an FBI record arising from my activities in the 1980s, working to stop U.S. intervention in Central America. Despite that history, however, I and the Citizens Crime Commission support the city having 2 Portland police officers assigned to the local JTTF. We do not support the proposed resolution withdrawing the city from the JTTF and preventing Portland police officers from participating. We urge you to vote no. This is the 3rd time the issue of participation on the JTTF has come before City Council. Given our concern for the safety and security of our citizens and the ability of the Portland business community to conduct its activities with safety and security, the Portland Citizens Crime Commission has been a consistent supporter of participation in the JTTF. We strongly support collaborative law enforcement and the sharing of information on potential threats to community safety and the leveraging of resources to respond to those threats. We offer our strong support for remaining within the JTTF. The JTTF is one of several collaborative joint task forces in which the Portland Police Bureau participates. Others include the Portland Violent Gang Safe Streets Task Force, the Oregon Human Trafficking Task Force, and the Regional Organized Crime Narcotics Task Force. The decision to revisit Portland's participation within the JTTF takes place within the context of a national conversation about race, power, and privilege, and a local conversation about excessive police force used against unarmed people of color and the disproportionate use of force against Antifa protesters. These are important conversations to be had as we struggle to form a more perfect union, nationally and here at home, and with our own rapidly changing community. Societal norms are changing, as they should, and our policing actions must reflect those changing societal norms. The Citizens Crime Commission fully supports efforts to address and deepen the conversation around perceived bias within our local law enforcement agencies and indeed within federal law enforcement agencies as well. We support efforts to increase training and de-escalation in mental health, such as those recently approved by voters in the state of Washington. We advocate for listening tours by law enforcement within vulnerable communities to deepen connection and enhance understanding. Building trust and confidence within communities that have, rightly or wrongly, long viewed the police as an occupying force will deter crime and strengthen law enforcement and adherence to the law. It is the essence of good community policing. Similarly, we acknowledge that while the JTTF is statutorily prescribed from gathering intelligence on anyone based on religion or political beliefs, some of the agencies participating in the JTTF have an imperfect historical record in that regard. The safety of our community, however, must be our paramount concern for City Council, for our law enforcement agencies, and for the community at large. It is the opinion of the Citizens Crime Commission that meaningful reform of our law enforcement agencies, both federal and local, must be a separate discussion from that of participation in the JTTF. Furthermore, the Crime Commission believes that it is today a particularly ill-advised moment in time to withdraw from the JTTF. The political polarization within our nation has manifested itself locally through repeated brawls in downtown Portland, fed by extremists from beyond our borders. Those individuals have been drawn to Portland because, deserved or not, Portland has a national reputation as a bastion of left-wing activism. Indeed, our mayor has been singled out on national television and in Congress as a left-wing activist. Bluntly put, Portland has a target on its back. Recent white supremacist attacks in the United States, including Charleston and Pittsburgh, are deeply concerning and must give us pause as we consider the momentous step of withdrawing from the JTTF. While we rarely hear of the quiet work of the JTTF to keep us safe, we just learned 2 weeks ago about the critical role a joint terrorism task force in upstate New York played in breaking up a conspiracy to attack the peaceful Muslim community known as Holy Islamburg. Participation in the JTTF is no guarantee of protection against such an attack. Nevertheless, it is our highest responsibility to ensure the safety of our community. Our collaborative engagement with other law enforcement agencies through the JTTF contributes to minimizing that risk. We strongly urge you to vote no on the resolution to withdraw the Portland Police Force from the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reichard. I neglected to mention that part of the panel is also Assistant Chief Jamie Resch. I apologize for that oversight. Next up, Carla, can we please tee up Chief Outlaw's statement? We're going to get our stretching in today, colleagues. It's going to be over our head here. I can't either, so I'm going to move. Is your mic on? There you go.
Good morning. My name is Billy Williams, and I'm the U.S. Attorney here in the District of Oregon, and I want to thank you, Mayor Wheeler, and members of the Council for this opportunity to present information about the JTTF. In my view, we are all safer in Portland by having Portland police officers involved in the JTTF. They're a valued partner and should remain so. Ongoing briefings and conversations with members of this body over time and community members over time have strengthened our partnerships, enhanced transparency and understanding, and is critical to dispelling what I view as misinformation about Portland's involvement in the JTTF. Partnerships between state, local, federal, and tribal law enforcement is essential to effective and safe public safety in the state of Oregon. That's a fact. Partnerships work. Let me be clear about something. The JTTF is not an immigration task force, plain and simple, and suggesting otherwise is flat out wrong. It does not target any individual or group based on race, religion, national origin, or First Amendment protected activity. Why? Because doing so is both illegal and, in my view, immoral. It isn't done that way. As a prosecutor, my job is to protect the community in a manner that ensures the civil rights of all Oregonians, and I take that responsibility very seriously. In my position as the U.S. Attorney, I'm very aware of the responsibility we have to communities that we serve, all communities, all members of every community. We must work to earn that trust every day, and we work very hard at it. Threats are real. The rapid evaluation of threats reported to law enforcement by community members must be done. The recent example of what happened in upstate New York is just one example. In Kansas City, threats to a mosque in the state of Kansas, 3 people recently sentenced for the threats that they engaged in. And there are countless others that are provided in a briefing packet that we put together for members of the council. The community can count on serious assessment and investigations of that information to protect public safety. I can assure you the daily decisions on these assessments made by this team are better with PPB officers' community knowledge, expertise, and resources, and that makes us all safer. We prepared a briefing today, and I defer to those who will be presenting on local threats and case examples that illustrate why it's so important that Portland remain on the JTTF. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mayor and Council. I'm Assistant Chief Jamie Resch, and I oversee the investigations branch for the Portland Police Bureau.
Assistant Chief, I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to please pull the microphone a little closer. The acoustics in here aren't very good. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. During my tenure at the Portland Police Bureau, I was assigned to the Criminal Intelligence Unit working with the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and I still maintain a clearance. As you can see from the chart we brought today, our system of oversight within the Bureau, the reporting structure is very clear. We have 2 criminal intelligence officers who report to a sergeant who then reports directly to the chief of police. These officers are still governed by all Oregon revised statutes, including what most know as ORS 151850, which is up there, which is now 181A820, that prohibits Oregon law enforcement officers from investigating any person whose only violation may be related to federal immigration laws. The officers and the sergeants are also required to follow every Police Bureau directive, including Directive 81010, that states no Bureau member shall interrogate, detain, arrest, initiate an investigation, or take other official action, police action against an individual based solely on the basis of immigration status. Finally, our Memorandum of Understanding between the Police Bureau and the FBI clearly states that Bureau members assigned to the JTTF shall notify the FBI special agent in charge, as well as the police chief, if they are ever asked to do anything that would violate an Oregon revised statute or Bureau policy. The police chief shall then immediately report any of these violations to the police commissioner. I want to reiterate Chief Outlaw's remarks regarding the importance of being brought in early in any assessment or investigation. It allows us to know what is occurring, bringing our resources, the Portland Police Bureau and the City of Portland's resources, to work to divert any possible act of violence in our community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Jessica Anderson. I apologize for my voice. I'm the supervisor of the International Terrorism Squad in Portland. Portland JTTF is comprised of 2 squads, a domestic terrorism and an international terrorism squad. Yes.
You sound really wobbly. Maybe if you could rearrange the mic or take a drink, maybe.
Each task force has between 5 and 10 agents, and task force officers from a handful of agencies work alongside these agents. The first slide, the pyramid slide, which you also have in front of you, reflects the possible stages of investigation after an incident is reported. The pre-assessment stage is the time where we evaluate whether or not there's any basis to move on to a Type 1 assessment. The majority of these come from the public and local law enforcement. A Type 1 assessment is an investigative assessment, and it requires the question, does the report have potential criminal activity or national security criminal activity? Every assessment, every Type 1 assessment that we work, which is the only type of assessment that Portland officers work on, require a nexus to potential criminal activity. And I appreciate Mr. German's recognition that he hasn't worked an assessment. In practicality, no assessment gets open without the supervisor approval. In many cases, information that comes in, no action is taken. You have an example on your second page of actual reports that came in where no further action was taken. They are related to First Amendment activity as well as non-credible information. The numbers that we have, the heat map here, approximately 300 incidents in the past year and a half. These go up and down, often depending on what's going on in the news cycle. We're at the anniversary of the Parkland shooting this year. We had a huge spike after that, and so those numbers sort of change a little bit year to year. When a pre-assessment evaluation reveals that there is some possible criminal activity, that is our authorized purpose to look into something. Our articulation of our authorized purpose is our way of stating how it is not based on race, color, creed, religion, or any other protected status. They're reviewed at our office as well as headquarters for compliance. The bulk of the work that task force officers work on is in this Type 1 assessment. The officers are assigned incidents that are related to Portland City. The vast majority of these wash out very quickly with no link to terrorism, and often the public doesn't know about the kind of diversion and off-ramping work that we do. On the third page is an example called assessment. There was a threat to the state capitol in which a threat was made online. Investigation identified who the individual was and that he had actual access to weapons. In collaboration with local officers and the Kaiser Salem Threat Assessment Team, we enabled cooperation from the family, got in front of the individual, and was able to get mental health and drug resources to that individual. That is a very common outcome in the assessments, and we're much more successful at doing that when we have the participation of local officers. A small group of assessments or other reports that come in do make their way up to a preliminary or a full investigation. On your fourth page, you'll see a page with 3 examples. Many full investigations never result in prosecution, and you have 3 examples there, 2 of which did not. In the first example, you have a young person who was being directly contacted by ISIS, being told to do told to do attacks. Investigation showed a very stable family life. We connected with the school resource officer who confirmed a very good, stable individual, and we identified that getting out and talking to this family might be the best course of action. And in fact, that resolved very quickly upon talking with the family and the child, and the school was able to do ongoing evaluation. In the second example, we have a full-on ISIS supporter. He talks openly about doing violence in Portland in the name of ISIS, conducting criminal activity in the name of ISIS. He's fully down a path of violent ideology and is resistant and has been resistant to any attempt to divert or off-ramp him. However, we do know that he had opportunities to engage in criminal activity and did not make that leap. He did not cross the line into criminal activity. And we've assessed that he's a talker and no prosecution will result from that. And Portland, we deem is not there's no threat from this person at this time. The last example is an individual also equally down a path of violent ideology, already engaged in criminal activity on behalf of a foreign terrorist organization. Attempts to divert this individual were completely unsuccessful. This example is Mohammed. This is an individual who actively sought out criminal behavior and as a result was convicted by an Oregon jury. This is not a success. No one in the FBI thinks this is a success. This individual going to prison for 30 years is a terrible outcome, and it is an outcome that we work on very hard to avoid, but there are instances where it does happen and needs to happen. There is a point sometimes with individuals who are so far down an ideological path that they cannot be turned around. And there's a point where our focus shifts from diverting that individual to protecting the local population. In closing, I want to reinforce that Portland officers, while they take investigative direction from me, they report to their chain. Their supervisors know exactly what they work on and are regularly engaged with myself and the other domestic terrorism supervisor. They are 100% bound by the laws and rules of the Portland Police Bureau and Oregon. And in fact, I keep copies of the Oregon statutes, including 181-575, to ensure that they are completely walled off from anything that would violate that. The idea that they don't have oversight is incorrect. They are heavily supervised by their own chain of command, who, as I said, are heavily involved and engaged with myself. PPB officers are never engaged in anything that involves an immigration angle. This is a hard stop, and I have to say it's actually very easy to comply with. In addition to the fact that the FBI never opens an assessment based on immigration or someone's religion, or any case for that matter. You have a packet that the U.S. Attorney Williams referred to. It shows the span of our work across the United States and in Portland, and reflects the variety of cases that we do, as well as the protections that we afford to everyone to practice their religion peacefully. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and good morning. My name is Ethan Knight. I'm an assistant U.S. attorney here in Portland, and I'm primarily responsible for handling the national security and terrorism prosecutions in our office. I've been handling these cases in most all of the major national security prosecutions in the state of Oregon for 10 years, and I've been prosecuting cases in this community for about 20 years. Equally as important as that background in speaking with you today, though, is my belief, feelings, and role in this community. I grew up here, I attended Portland Public Schools, and in doing that, I've always believed that this is a community that solves problems, that embraces community involvement, and leans in when there are tough decisions to be made. And it's with that background I want to talk to you a little bit about today the role of the U.S. Attorney's Office in the JTTF in solving problems and what we really do on a day-to-day basis, and help address some of those concerns and help explain why this role of the Portland Police on the JTTF is essential for off-roading cases that may not be worthy of prosecution, is essential for preserving public safety, and most importantly, is essential for this community having a place at the table when tough decisions are made and when law enforcement is looking at some of the most serious and significant challenges it faces. So I want to do two things today. First, I want to talk a little bit about the practical oversight that we get and the agents get on a day-to-day basis. You've heard a lot about the big picture, a lot about JTTFs, understandably, with some concerns in other parts of the country. But I want to talk to you about Portland. And then I want to talk to you,
5 minutes.
I want to talk to you about two specific cases that actually resulted in prosecutions here in Portland. Now, as Agent Anderson alluded to, even as prosecutors, our goal is not to get these investigations to a case where there's a prosecution. The biggest success is the one you never hear about. It's the case where we successfully off-road someone into services. It's the case where we have collaboratively determined a threat does not exist. It's not the case that winds up on the front page of the paper. Those happen, and we'll be prepared to handle those. But when you have the Portland Police at the table, a local agency that is the largest law enforcement agency in the state, we are better equipped to handle those cases and get folks to the right place and hopefully not to a courtroom. So let me talk about what that oversight looks like. And at the outset, I want to just address something Mr. Jama said, because I think it's a very good point and a concern that maybe many of you have. And that relates to the role of the Trump administration and what maybe I do day to day or what those I work with do day to day. I can tell you what often gets lost in this debate is that I, like many of my colleagues and agents, are civil servants. I have served 3 presidents, half a dozen attorneys general, and my goal and role is to adhere to the law and to the Constitution and to my community. And that's what we do. And that's critical in understanding and evaluating the role of the Portland Police going forward on the JTTF, because that's what matters. Now, the oversight itself, I've got a board behind you there that is not intended to put you to sleep. I could probably do that on my own, but it shows the layers of oversight from the different branches of government to the day-to-day operations of the assistant U.S. attorneys who work with the FBI and to the Portland JTTF. There's extensive executive oversight, layers of administration in the Department of Justice. There is extensive judicial oversight. I think what gets lost as well is when we talk about the activities of law enforcement in the community and going out and conducting things like surveillance, which are significant issues. If there's a Fourth Amendment issue involved, a court's going to be involved. And I have that ethical obligation to ensure that that occurs. And that's part of the process. And as has already been discussed, Portland police have to adhere to the law and those rules as well. And that's part of the process. There's extensive congressional oversight in what we do and the processes that come along with this system. But to give you a more practical insight as to how this works, and this will help us lead into talking about some of these cases you may have heard about and some you may not have. On a day-to-day basis, it's my job to work with these agents specifically to identify threats, to see if there are cases that are worthy of prosecution, and to move forward and make the best decisions we can. Now, at this point, the question may come up, why does it matter if the Portland police are at the table when those discussions are being had and when I'm there and when others are there talking with the JTTF? It matters because they are a voice from this community. It matters because the Portland police bring a unique perspective and insight into local law enforcement and needs that simply can't be met, speaking as a federal prosecutor, by our federal resources alone. And so when the question is asked, well, does it really make a difference if 2 officers, 3 officers are there on the JTTF? The answer is absolutely yes, it makes a difference, because that voice needs to be there. That expertise needs to be there, and that knowledge of the community needs to be there when we go forward in these investigations in these cases. So I'll just take a few more moments of your time, and I want to talk about 2 cases, actual cases that have been prosecuted here in Oregon, to show what happens when a case makes it all the way through these early stages you've heard a little bit about, in the investigative stage to the prosecution stage. The first of those is United States versus Reyes-Khan. It's the board on the right there. Mr. Khan was convicted after pleading guilty here in Oregon based on his involvement in an al-Qaeda-sponsored bombing in Lahore, Pakistan in 2009 that killed and injured over 300 people. He was here in Oregon. Most importantly, he was a city employee. And at the time that this case took place, Portland was not on the JTTF. In this community, it's, from my perspective, handling this case, the city of Portland and the Portland police should have had a seat at the table while this was going on. Now, not all cases involve somebody in a community being involved in an al-Qaeda bombing, but it matters to have that voice at the table. The second case that's currently pending that offers a different flavor of that local involvement in the JTTF is United States versus Jason Schaefer. That case involves an individual charged here with making bomb-making materials and actually detonating a bomb when he was approached at his vehicle by JTTF officers from other local law enforcement organizations. There were a number of fast-moving threats, obviously, with someone making those materials in this community that were effectively addressed by a task force model of law enforcement. Those are just two of the cases. And again, I want to reiterate, the goal is to have as many people at the table to try and avoid situations where we're ultimately prosecuting people and sending them to prison. So in closing, I cannot emphasize enough that this is not simply a public safety question. It is a community question. And in this community, we need to have those seats at the table and the Portland Police continuing their involvement in the JTTF. Thank you.
Thank you. Does that conclude your presentation?
Yes, thank you.
So, colleagues, we have 29 seconds. We have one more brief video presentation. Can I ask your forbearance for that? Very good. Carla, can you tee that up, please? First for questions. We'll just go round robin. Very good. All right, so we're at the Q&A. We're going to do a round robin, 5 minutes each. And if a commissioner is sort of cut off in the middle, what we'll do is let the commissioner get an answer, hopefully a quick answer. I would encourage our panelists, given the number of people who want to ask questions, please be very brief. Yes or no is even sufficient. Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you all for testifying today. This is a critical issue for our community, and so I appreciate the seriousness in which we are having this dialogue. I want to start with asking the FBI a question. It was alluded to that, well, actually you said that there were 300 incidents of threats last year in Portland. Can you give me a demographic breakdown of the individuals that were identified as a potential threat?
And colleagues, while they're figuring out who will answer, I'll remind you the chief and the 2 officers are on the line and available to answer questions.
I don't have a demographic breakdown of the 300 incidents. What I can say is that there were, sorry, for the record, Ren Cannon, the SEC for the FBI. I don't have a demographic breakdown at this time. What I can say is that there were many more incidents or tips that were called in, as SSA Anderson explained. Some of those were screened. 300 threat assessments were opened and worked. And what I can say is that those roughly mirror the demographics of the state.
They roughly mirror the demographics of the state, is that what you said?
Yes.
So we would think that 3% would have been African American, 10% would have been Latino, and the rest would have been white people who were investigated?
I don't have specific, I'd have to go back and try to find those.
Well, then you shouldn't try to answer it if you don't have the answer. Thank you. My next question has to, Billy, you did a letter to the editor stating the reasons why you thought we should stay in the Joint Terrorism Task Force. And you were quoted as saying, "We always want law enforcement to exercise good, well-informed judgment that protects our civil liberties." We've seen the Proud Boys and other white supremacist groups marching throughout the street. We've seen Portland police officers attack counter-protesters. Is that a model of law enforcement living up to what you believe their role should be?
That's sort of a baited question, but I think you can find examples throughout the United States of good and not so good examples of law enforcement engagement. Those are ones that we learn from. The same is true. Look, I was involved from the beginning of the Civil Rights Division and U.S. Attorney investigation of Portland Police Bureau and the work that's gone on since the settlement agreement. I'm a member of the Attorney General's Advisory Committee Civil Rights Subcommittee.
You're sucking up my time, Billy. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm just saying, it's a baited question. I think you're trying to offer an answer in the question, and you can come up with all kinds of examples of great police work. So that's my answer.
Anybody from the FBI can answer this one. Why have you failed to acknowledge that white supremacist activity have been building in our community in the United States for the last 20 years? And when I met with you in my office, everybody talked about actually prosecuting white supremacy, but we don't hear that from the FBI, Mr. Cannon. Can you explain why?
The FBI aggregates hate crime statistics across the country. They've definitely shown a rise. There's been significant prosecutions around the country, so Kansas City, upstate New York, Los Angeles, the Ram indictment, those were all briefed to you. So that would be the answer there.
Again, Mr. Cannon, but what we've seen in Portland has been Portland police officers attacking counter-protesters and protecting white supremacists in our community. And so have you opened any investigations into Portland police officers as they've been responding to white supremacists in this community?
As you know, Commissioner, I can't comment on ongoing investigations or what we do or don't investigate. Those are ongoing investigations and they haven't been adjudicated.
Have you in the past conducted any investigations of Portland police as it relates to white supremacy?
I'd have to go back and check. I've been here for 2 years. I can't comment on ongoing investigations right now. And if you want us to go back and do a historic search, we can certainly do that if you'd like us to.
20 seconds left. This is for the DOJ. Considering the current hateful rhetoric coming out of D.C., why would we believe that that's not impacting your day-to-day work?
I've lived here a long time, prosecutor for almost 30 years, state and federal, the last 18, worked under 5 presidents and various attorneys general. I think Ethan Knight provided a perfectly clear answer as to why the work we do, we're mindful of our constitutional and legal responsibilities and ethical ones as well.
Time's up for this round. Commissioner Fish.
Thank you, Mayor and colleagues. I also want to compliment all the testifiers today. This is exactly the kind of discussion I hope we would have about a serious topic, and I, for one, have felt that there's no need to rush this conversation, and I'm learning things just through this hearing, and it will inform my thinking about amendments and other things that we might do going forward. But there's a number of things I want to clear up in round 1, and then I'm going to come back a little deeper on round 2. Let's start with Mr. Williams. We had Jessica Anderson testify that the Portland Police Bureau is not engaged in immigration cases. Mr. Jama, in his letter, says that ICE is the largest partner in JTTF activities nationally. My question for you is ICE formally a member of the Portland JTTF?
ICE has a membership in the JTTF. I don't know how to answer Mr. Jama's assertion on the national statistics. We can certainly look at that. They don't play a predominant role like any other agency. We have a number of agencies represented, but we're not an immigration task force. I can't say that any more clear. And as has been explained by PPB and by Special Agent Anderson, Portland police officers are walled off from anything related to immigration. And I might add, statewide, we work with state, county, and tribal law enforcement all over the state of Oregon, mindful of those Oregon sanctuary, so-called sanctuary law. And we find ways to make it work because we respect each other's legal responsibilities, and we endeavor to honor those and yet keep people safe. But that's a long-winded answer to your original question.
Okay.
And Commissioner, if I could just clarify, Homeland Security investigations of DHS and ICE, Homeland Security investigations is part of the Portland JTTF. Enforcement and removal operations is not a part of the Portland JTTF.
Okay, that's what I thought. Do any of our distinguished panelists dispute the notion that Portland faces a real threat of domestic and foreign terrorism? Does anyone dispute that? I don't want to make sure it gets lost in the discussion. So hearing none, we all acknowledge that it's a real threat. The question that we're grappling with is an important question about how to balance safety with our civil liberties. And it's a question that, frankly, we should have on a regular basis, whether we're in or out of the JTTF. Mr. German, I think this is the third time I've had the pleasure of hearing you testify. And we welcome you from New York. Apparently you got in ahead of the snowstorm.
Actually, I live in San Francisco now.
Oh, you live in San Francisco.
A little closer.
My question for you, sir, is what is your personal history with the Portland JTTF?
I don't know that I'm allowed to talk about that. That's not things that I did. I have to get pre-publication review for. So
well, let me say this. I hadn't expected that answer, but it's a fair response. So let me do a little tap dancing. We're here essentially talking about the JTTF since 2015, which is when the council last authorized that we'd go all in. Between 2015 and the present, what has been your personal history with the Portland JTTF?
I have no personal history with them.
Okay. But let me go a little deeper.
Okay.
Because I appreciate particularly your work through the Brennan Center, which I have a high regard for, that you bring the perspective of what's going on nationally, and I think it's very important that we track what's going on nationally. But I think it's also, since we're talking about this particular relationship, I think it's important that we focus on the Portland JTTF. And so what specific knowledge do you have of any alleged abuses by the Portland JTTF since 2015?
So it's hard to know what, because there isn't transparency, what is from the JTTF and what is from other aspects of the FBI. But there were a number of cases after a Seattle May Day protest where some windows were broken, and particularly a window at a U.S. courthouse, which triggered federal jurisdiction. And there were armed raids of a number of groups throughout Washington and Portland. And what struck me about those raids is when I looked at the search warrant, it was looking for things like address books, cell phones, not bombs, not guns. And there ended up being grand jury investigations, and people who didn't cooperate with the grand jury investigations actually went to jail for long periods of time.
Right, and we're talking Seattle.
Well, some of these were in Portland. Some of the activists were in Portland. So it was actually Portland that was working, or not Portland, but Oregon. So I assume that they were off the JTTF.
Just to follow up, Mayor, and have any of those activists filed legal claims to your knowledge?
My understanding is yes.
And they're pending?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Fritz.
That went quickly.
We'll come back.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here, and thanks everybody for this discussion. Are FBI officers bound by Oregon revised statutes?
What I can explain to you what we're bound by is DIOX. So just to give a visual representation and not to get too deep into it, this was the Attorney General guidelines referenced in earlier testimony back in 1989.
I was actually just wanting a yes or no answer.
This is what we're bound by as of 2008. This is what we're bound by as of 2011. I didn't print the current version of the DIOG. It's 800 pages, and interspersed throughout that 800 pages is a prohibition on opening cases or conducting investigation based on First Amendment activity, race, religion, sexual orientation, etc.
But you are allowed to do surveillance, unlike the Portland police officers. Is that correct?
I believe all law enforcement agencies are allowed to do surveillance.
So is there information in the database that's gathered elsewhere that is not in compliance with Oregon law?
There's a disconnect between Oregon law and federal law. So federal immigration statutes differ from Oregon law. Marijuana statutes differ from. So you'd have to clarify your question about what specifically you're looking for.
Well, maybe I'll just move to the next question, might be clarifying. You just said that Portland police officers are walled off from immigration issues. How are they walled off from immigration issues? Are there different permissions in the database as to who can look at what information?
Sure, I can answer that. So they are not assigned anything. They do not work on anything or are assigned anything where the individual who has the potential criminal activity has an immigration status.
But there's information in the database that can they still see that information?
They don't, they are totally, they know not to look at it. They don't work it. I don't ask them to engage in any way on it. And it would be prohibited by our policies to review anything that didn't pertain to your investigations.
Okay, thank you. I noticed in this chart that the Oregon Attorney General has no oversight. Is that correct?
I mean, that's correct. I, like my colleagues, work for the United States Attorney and the U.S. Department of Justice, so we're not technically supervised by the Oregon Attorney General. However, like the Oregon Attorney General, I'm subject to the rules of the Oregon State Bar and the ethical rules attendant to those regulations.
Yeah, because I noticed that you've got the State Bar on there. How do they do oversight?
Well, for example, I can't make a misrepresentation to a court.
But they don't do any kind of audits or investigations. It's basically if somebody complains, is that right?
Yes, or if a judge initiates something. So any conduct a lawyer engages in which is unethical, essentially.
Okay, thank you. In 2015, we were told that we couldn't change the standard MOU, that it's a national one and we can't have special bits of what you have to do in Portland versus elsewhere. Is that still the case?
Any changes would have to be reviewed and sent to headquarters, but we can make amendments based on approval at headquarters.
Okay, thank you. And then finally, can you give me some examples of how, specifically how Portland Police Bureau participation has made a difference in the last 4 years? I noticed one of your examples said that you talked to school resource officers. The school resource officer isn't a member of the JTTF, so you'd be able to talk to them anyway. So how specifically has our police officers being in your task force made a difference in Portland?
I think what happens is things happen faster and better. When they're sitting with us and they're sitting next to us, there's an engagement that can happen right away that doesn't happen when people are in separate buildings. And I think we all have experiences where when we work closely and in proximity to people, the work gets done more efficiently and better.
But could you just give me a specific example of obviously in a closed case, because you're not going to talk about open investigations, but in a closed case of where a Portland police officer's intervention altered the outcome?
Absolutely. There was a situation where an officer on the JTTF was familiar with an individual whose name had come across the radar screen in the JTTF and was able to, because of that knowledge of the person's background, successfully divert that circumstance into social services, whereas had the police not been there, that knowledge wouldn't have been available to the rest of the JTTF, without getting specific, obviously. So it's that kind of knowledge, and that is an example. And to your earlier question about the school resource officer, you're absolutely right. A school resource officer wouldn't be on the JTTF, but it's the kind of situation where a Portland police officer would say, you know what, you should check with the school resource officer because this really may not be a threat. But if the Portland police aren't in the room for that discussion, the rest of us at the JTTF or the FBI don't know to make that call and to stop that further investigation there and devote our resources somewhere else.
Commissioner Udaley.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I apologize to Ren. My son was hospitalized yesterday, and I missed my annual FBI briefing. I'm taking a break from that to come here today because this issue is so important. I do need to preface my questions, so I might not get to most of them till the second round. First, I want to say that any questions I ask today are not meant to impugn anyone in this room or anyone serving on our police bureau or in the JTTF. I know that there are many good people. Most of the people involved are good people who and many I've gotten to know, trust and respect. However, good people can make bad decisions, and especially when we are talking about an agency that I consider to be a rogue agency, which is ICE, who we know is committing civil and human rights violations across our country. I can't put all of that aside. So the big issue I'm having with this conversation is it's not reassuring to sit in this room listening to the accomplishments of JTTFs across the country without an acknowledgement of the many ways in which other units or task forces have violated individuals' civil rights or simply are focusing their resources on the wrong people. I referenced Denver, Colorado, where JTTF was surveilling left-wing activists, Sacramento, which was mentioned earlier with Banff, activists in the Dakota Access Pipeline, Black Lives Matter in Bloomington, Minnesota. I personally was connected to a group of activists in the early 1990s that was being illegally surveilled by the Portland Police Bureau, and that came out in a court case, and as a result, policies were changed. So this isn't some, wingnut conspiracy theory that these things happen. I know they happen because they happen to people that I know and groups that I was connected to, and I can say that I was not planning to, nor did I commit any crimes, and I felt that my civil rights were violated and that my ability to exercise those rights was discouraged. So, I have 3 questions. Maybe we'll get to them. The number one question, and I guess I would open this up to anyone who wants to give it a brief answer, is how do we justify the risk of civil and human rights violations by our continued involvement in JTTF? That is the core question for me in this conversation.
I'll take a stab at it. First off, I think there has to be an acknowledgement of the scenarios and situations, Commissioner, that you've outlined and that our colleagues across the table have outlined here in Oregon as well as nationally, and recognize mistakes have occurred.
Thank you.
And not say there are any, not to belabor justifications, but just to acknowledge mistakes are made. Groups advocating for review and policy changes, congressional oversight, all of those things are so critical for us being better at what we do. And at the same time, balancing that with the need for being able to make assessments of threats, for instance, and having the tools and the partnerships to address the ongoing realities that those of us in law enforcement deal with, ever mindful of the responsibilities and constitutional rights.
I'd like to squeeze in one more question.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry, but that's,
Yeah.
it's a big question.
Yeah.
That's the way I would answer it.
My next question is really of how we're allocating scant resources, and with the failure to recognize the biggest terror threat to public safety and national security, which is white right-wing extremists. That's the other question I'm grappling with, and we'll just return to that when it comes back around to me.
Very good. I'll actually start with that. Do we still have officers Mike and Brian on the phone? Do we have the? Yeah, good. Okay, so here's my question. This is the police commissioner. Is it fair to say that the increase in violent extremism by white nationalists and white supremacists that we see in the news reflects the types of cases that you routinely investigate? Mr. German wrote a letter in April of 2018 to the City Council. He writes that, quote, Portland police officers assigned to the JTTF would find it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to comply with Oregon law while conducting routine operations under the FBI's counterterrorism authorities and practices, unquote. He says this because of the expansion of FBI authority to conduct surveillance, gather intelligence, and investigate people and organizations not suspected of criminal activity. Ms. Anderson, how do you respond to this assertion?
As I mentioned before, I guess the most succinct way would be that because even with a task force officer on a task force, they're not duplicating every role that an agent could do. And in that regard, we're able to separate them out from different activities, and in that way, separate them out from anything that would cross the line and violate one of the Oregon statutes. As I mentioned, it is something that I pay a lot of attention to. I have absolutely no vested interest in ever crossing that line and ever presenting anything to them that would have them question where that line is. So it's just something we pay a lot of attention to. And
thank you. Officers Matt or Brian, I remind you that you are subject to a truthfulness directive. I'd like to hear from one of you on this subject. In conducting your work under this partnership, have you ever violated Oregon law? Okay, and do you find it difficult under the construct of the Joint Terrorism Task Force to comply with Oregon law? Thank you. I'd like to quickly call attention to Section 5B5 of the MOU, which addresses conflicts between governing agency standards, policies, and laws. And we've had a lot of back and forth on this morning. It reads, quote, where there is conflict between the standards and requirements of the participating agency and the FBI, the standard or requirement that provides the greatest organizational benefit will apply. Assistant Chief Resch, this is a question for you. Whose organizational benefit is prioritized in that provision, 5B5?
The Portland Police Bureau's. Absolutely. It is 100% our benefit that is prioritized by not only the officers, but by Agent Anderson, who makes that the priority and ensures that that's what our officers' focus is.
Thank you. Mr. Jama, thank you for being here as always. Given your more general concerns that you stated about the FBI, do you believe that the city should withdraw from the other FBI task forces in which the Portland Police Bureau is a participant, including the Child Exploitation Task Force and the Human Trafficking Task Force?
I think it's an important question, and the answer is no. I believe that the JTTF is a particular case, and I do believe that we should withdraw the JTTF. And the simple reason is that I think it's been mentioned a lot. I can't specifically talk about client confidentiality. I worked with the situations where I get calls after FBI visit for the families that I work with. I have situations where families informed that middle school children were interviewed at the schools by what I believe they believed was the FBI agents. I think it's this particular agency, the JTF task force, for me, it's a very challenging one.
So even though it is the same agency, you do not see any conflict in remaining in those other task forces?
I am not an expert on what the other agency does, so my answer, I don't have enough information to say, again, yes or no. I think I do believe the children should be protected. So my answer to you is that I am here just today, particularly the JTTF. The other agencies, I don't have enough information to subject one way or another.
Thank you. Commissioner Hardesty, you're up.
Thank you, Mayor. Assistant Chief Reese, did I say that right? Resch, sorry. I have a question. Can you tell me how many times Portland Police Bureau officers have had anti-bias training, listening tours, and de-escalation training?
How many times?
Yeah.
3 of those?
Oh, yeah, say over the last decade.
Countless hours of, sorry. We've had countless hours of each. I do not have a breakdown for each specific one.
Thank you. So, Mr. Ricker, when you said that, all we need to do is do more training for Portland police officers, we should do anti-bias listening trainings. I've lived here for almost 30 years. We've done at least 30 of them in the time that I've lived here. We're always doing de-escalation. We're always retraining Portland police officers. However, it doesn't feel like the training actually translates to the street. So do you have any additional proposals about how Portland Police could be, could work jointly with the Joint Tourism Task Force and not actually be involved in the kind of activity that you would hope to change through this training?
In response to your question, I recognize that there have been that all of the police agencies have engaged in a lot of these activities and the behaviors don't change. There are examples out there in the United States of communities that have successfully addressed some of the issues that we face here in Portland, although those communities are few and far between.
I was going to say, I need a list, please.
I believe it's Daytona Beach in Florida that has successfully addressed the issues of police violence. I'm not aware of any others that have done that. I know some of the things that people have done to successfully address these issues. Among them is requiring the police to live in the community that they come from. That's one of the recommendations that is out there. We also have I believe, the lowest police to citizen ratio of any major city in the United States. Police.
Sorry, sir, I'm going to have to cut you off because I only have a short period of time. Thank you very much for that answer. Assistant Chief, you stated that we use all the resources available to us for the City of Portland and the Portland Police Bureau. Please elaborate on that because we didn't think we were putting a lot of resources into this JTTF task force.
What I meant by that is that when something is deemed not a threat, one of the lower levels down on the triangle there are other options that we can provide people. We have our behavioral health unit. We have our many councils that we're involved in. We have culturally specific resources that we can provide to people that may not need full investigation, but also may need some assistance, and we are able to provide that as the Police Bureau.
Thank you, Assistant Chief. Forgive me for just like cutting people off, but when you have a short period of time, you can't spend a lot of time. Mr. Cannon, can you tell me, would you answer, how would you find mental health services and other community social services without Portland Police Bureau members sitting across the table?
We would look for another partner. We look for other partnerships in the local area and try to build a relationship so that we could have that kind of teamwork. But it would be subject also to the terms of what was dictated for Portland Police, by this body.
Thank you. Assistant Chief, one more time. We have seen that Portland Police Bureau officers have they have bigger weapons, they have become much more aggressive in their interaction in the community. Is that impacted at all by having police officers sitting at the Joint Terrorism Task Force table?
No.
Then what is that influenced by?
It's in response to a number of factors, including what's going on around us, the threats that are involved around us, but not necessarily what's going on with the Joint Terrorism Task Force.
Thank you. Let's see, who else? Mr. Williams, you and I have been involved with the Department of Justice Civil Rights investigation of Portland Police since its inception. Do you believe we're better off today because of the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division coming to Portland?
With the U.S. Attorney's Office, yes. That was a joint endeavor because in many cities, the U.S. Attorney's Office didn't necessarily join those investigations. We did.
I'm out of time, and I just want to say most people have been killed by Portland police since the Department of Justice have been here, were people suffering from mental health issues.
Commissioner Fish.
Mayor, do we still have the two officers on the phone?
We do.
Carla?
Yes, we
do. Can you both hear me? Okay, so a question for both of you. My understanding is that your service on this task force predates the current presidential administration. Have either of you seen any change in the priorities or day-to-day work of being on this task force since the current administration took office? Okay. Jessica Anderson talked about walling you off from immigration cases. Have either of you, since 2015, worked on an immigration case? One of the concerns I have about the current debate is it assumes that somehow there's something inherently corrupting about having police officers at the table with the FBI, as opposed to my view, which is it brings Portland values to the table and has our eyes and ears overseeing the FBI. So you can look at it through one of two lenses. In my view, we gain by having our values at the table, by having carefully trained police officers pushing back, by having that level of engagement with the FBI. But I'm curious, for either of the two officers on the phone, what do you believe Portland loses if we pull out of the task force? Yes, sir. The FBI has described your role to me as essentially the community policing arm of what they do at the JTTF. Is that a fair characterization? Thank you very much. I want to turn to Zara Ballou. Did I pronounce that correctly? From San Francisco. I think we owe you a question or two, and thank you for being here. You mentioned Oakland, and my understanding, first of all, is that Oakland continues to participate in the JTTF. Is that correct?
Correct. Oakland passed legislation requiring annual reporting, and their first report has been met with disappointment and concern for the lack of transparency or actual confirmation even that Oakland police officers are actually adhering to local standards.
So I guess the point I wanted just to give you a moment to elaborate on, because I'm going to be proposing some amendments tomorrow to strengthen our oversight and to strengthen the way the JTTF functions. Is there anything that you have observed in Oakland which you think is instructive of how to strengthen community oversight of the JTTF?
I would say that what I've observed in a combination of San Francisco and Oakland is the FBI's unwillingness to be transparent with local oversight bodies and provide the information that is requested. So much so that in San Francisco, which is several years ahead of Oakland, the ultimate decision was that the Board of Supervisors and the police department together said we should withdraw. Oakland is a couple of years behind on sort of where they are in the process, but this first report is a good indication of the concerns to come.
Good, thank you.
Commissioner Fritz.
Thanks again for everybody for your patience. The one time I voted to go back to have a relationship with the JTTF was in 2011. It was for the reasons that Commissioner Fish mentioned, that I thought we would bring Portland values to the group and that we would get more information from the group about what was going on. But then, as was alluded to from San Francisco, the reports were laughable and then stopped altogether, and we've had nothing at all since we've been back in the task force as a full member. Why? And how would things be different if we renew this memorandum, the MOU?
The annual meeting with you is when I first knew that you were expecting a report, so I appreciate you bringing that to my attention, Commissioner. That's why we do those annual meetings. We dug into it and found that what was expected, or what we thought was on the table, was a compliance report. It was coming from the Portland Police Bureau. We didn't have a lot of input to that, so since our meeting with you, we've been engaging with CIU and with the chain of command at Portland Police Bureau to develop a more extensive report and give you as much information as we can.
And do you have that ready for me now? Because that was one of the questions I asked about a month ago, to tell me what have you been doing for the past 4 years?
We have forwarded information to Chief Outlaw and her staff for their review. I'm not sure where it is from there.
So could you address that, please? I don't have it.
Yes, the 2019 report is available for you, and I can provide that to you.
And if you could provide it to the public as well, please.
Yes.
Because that was the other thing. There was supposed to be public review, public discussion of how it's... Also, colleagues, I need to let you know that apparently what came in over the phone didn't get captioned, so therefore people watching couldn't actually hear what the answers were. So if there's anything that you learned over the phone that you want to state, then I'm going to yield the rest of my time, and you can go ahead and do so.
Very good. Commissioner Udaly.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to ask a couple very brief questions before giving Mr. German a chance to respond to my last question. One, maybe this is for the Assistant Chief. I understand there's a proposal on the table to have Chief Outlaw receive the necessary clearance to be informed about JTTF activities. Is it possible for the Mayor to also receive this clearance as our Police Commissioner?
Yes, I believe it's in process for the chief, and I will candidly answer that.
We don't typically do clearances for mayors because there's so many mayors around the country, and they're expensive to process. And because the commissioner has a dual hat, it's an unusual situation where the mayor of Portland is also the commissioner of police. We've utilized the arrangement of non-disclosure agreements, which allow him full access. So with the chain of command at Portland having clearances, they can advise the mayor when there's something that needs to be briefed on. We read him in for the day and give him a full briefing.
Okay.
Functionally, the access from the mayor is no different than if you had a clearance.
Okay, thank you. I believe we've learned that withdrawing from the JTTF would not change the way that we participate in other joint activities with the FBI. But it's my understanding that the JTTF deploys agents and officers in response to active shooter situations. If Portland withdraws, does this mean the FBI would no longer assist in these scenarios?
No, we would still respond.
Okay. Mr. German, I had asked a kind of broad question about if this is the best use of our limited resources, given the fact that the FBI considers the KKK to consist of members that some perceive to be supportive of a white supremacist agenda, which, I mean, I just gotta say that's astounding. And the fact that over 70% of the extremist-related deaths in the between 2008 and 2017 were committed by white right-wing extremists, and in fact last year all of the deaths were committed by right-wing extremists. Is there a better way we could be using these resources and addressing the real threat to public safety?
There is, and obviously state and local law enforcement and the FBI and other federal law enforcement often do very good work that's important to keeping us safe. Nobody disputes that. But how you also serve the other half of their job, which is protecting civil liberties, has to do with triage, right? How do we pick who we are going to choose to investigate? And removing the requirement for a reasonable indication of criminal activity is where the problem starts. And with all due respect to the officers on the phone, what Oregon law requires is that no intelligence is collected or maintained absent that reasonable suspicion. But any participation or in an FBI pre-assessment, in an FBI assessment, or an FBI preliminary investigation is by definition not meeting the reasonable suspicion standard. Moreover, even if they're only working on full investigations, they're using FBI data sets that are maintaining information collected without reasonable suspicion. And there's a lot of language we have to be careful of. Often it's been said that they don't target based on race and ethnicity. The FBI has a racial and ethnic mapping program. The rule they have says they can't start an investigation based solely on race. So when at the ACLU we obtained some of these racial and ethnic mapping program documents, it was things like there are historical examples of Chinese Americans being involved in organized crime in San Francisco. So we're going to map where all the Chinese Americans live in San Francisco, right? So if the Portland police officers have access to those maps and are making investigative decisions based on those maps, those are all collected without reasonable suspicion of any criminal activity. And to the point specifically about hate crimes, we put out a report about 6 months ago. The Department of Justice victim survey suggests there are about 250,000 hate crimes a year. As was mentioned, state and local police, only about 10% of them actually report, but they report about 7,000 hate crimes a year. The federal government prosecutes about 25 to 30 a year. So I think that's a pretty clear indicator of where the priorities are.
Thank you.
I'm going to defer my time to my colleagues, but I want to give Chief Outlaw an opportunity to respond to anything that you've heard at this point. Chief, if you're still with us.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. No, I think everything's been covered. I'm available if you have any questions for me. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mayor. I almost called you Chief. Mr. Williams, do you believe in Oregon sanctuary law?
Sorry, do I believe what?
Do you believe in Oregon sanctuary law?
Oregon's so-called sanctuary law, because there really isn't a legal definition of sanctuary.
Really a yes or no question, Mr. Williams. You either believe it or you don't?
I understand it exists.
I asked this because I have a letter to the editor that you wrote as a guest opinion a year ago that clearly states that you did not support Oregon sanctuary law. And so that's why I asked the question.
What I clearly stated was I thought it was a shame that an individual with a significant prior criminal history was repeatedly released here in Multnomah County and sexually assaulted 2 women without notification. to ICE of his impending release.
So again, that is the law in Oregon, so we're supposed to believe that the FBI and the Joint Terrorism Task Force is following Oregon's law, so whether we agree with it or not, that is the law in Oregon?
We're not required to follow Oregon law. We're required to follow federal law. It is the PPB officers assigned to the JTTF who must follow, as been described repeatedly here, must follow state law, and we respect that.
But again, if you don't support this law and we have Portland police officers working with you as part of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, then it is a slippery slope that we go down. You have testified here earlier that you supported Oregon state law, and so we can't have it both ways. You either support it or you don't.
That's your opinion, Commissioner.
And I'm entitled to have one, I guess. Thank you. Mr. Cannon, based on what I've just talked about, which is Mr. Williams' opposition to the sanctuary law here in Oregon, what is the FBI stance on Oregon sanctuary law?
The FBI doesn't have a stance on Oregon sanctuary law.
You don't have a stance?
No.
So that's very troubling to me that our federal partners don't have a stance on Oregon sanctuary law. I appreciate that. Appreciate that edification. My next question is to the Assistant Chief. Assistant Chief, knowing what you've just heard here, how do you make sure that Portland police officers are actually following Oregon state law as compared to what the feds may or may not interpret as our law?
So as you know, there are many laws that differ between state and federal government, and it's my job to ensure that the officers ensure all of the ones that are required by the state. You've mentioned one, but there are many others, and they enforce those just as well. As far as the FBI's opinion on our state law, they follow by what they're guided by, and our officers follow what we're guided by, and that's what I am entrusted to enforce.
And so, as a layperson who is not law enforcement, I find it very troubling to try to figure out how you can keep this brick wall between the two. Because as we've heard from testimony earlier, the federal government has a wide breadth of information that they can gather, and Oregon limits what our law enforcement can do. So how can you assure the public that we are safe from federal intrusion since they don't support the law that we have here locally?
Because the officers who are working for the JTTF do support that law, and they have taken an oath to support those laws, and they continue to do that each and every day for the citizens of Portland.
Can you, Assistant Chief, can you give me a situation, oh, I'm sorry, not you, the city attorney. Could you tell me if there has been a time, the law requires you to annually train Portland police officers that are part of the Joint Terrorism Task Force to ensure that they are following Oregon state law? Are you doing that annually?
We are. We do that as part of our regular training for the Bureau, and we have done quite a bit of training in particular on the statutes that I've mentioned.
You do it as a regular part of your training, but we only have 2 police officers. Are you doing separate training for those 2, or are you doing this training in conjunction with all Portland police officers?
Commissioner, I'll have to get that information and get it back to you. I know that I spoke with the attorney who oversees and coordinates our work for Portland Police Bureau, and we discussed whether that training was occurring, and it is occurring, but I don't have the information as to how specifically it's occurring.
Nick, you're going to be the last step today.
So I want to ask my friend Casey Jama a couple questions. The first is that my understanding of Commissioner Hardesty's resolution is that we would withdraw from the JTTF, but within 60 days, she or the mayor or both would report back on how we would handle on an as-needed basis cooperation with the FBI. And my question to you, Casey, is given the fundamental concerns that you've raised about participation in the JTTF, how do you square our participation on an as-needed basis?
Thank you, Commissioner Fish. I think the important thing is that as we move forward, the information that we learn from the process will help us to determine how to move forward. I am always a believer that we should uphold people's civil liberties. And if we have questions about that, we should definitely not be continues to be part of it. But as your question about need basis involvement, it's important that we have to come to that point. When we come to that point, we have to make a decision about it.
Okay. Let me ask you another question. In your very thoughtful letter that you gave us, you closed by saying, let's stand up together for communities who need our support in these dark times. One of the things that has struck me about this debate is how many individuals and organizations I've heard from who believe that we can participate in the JTTF without sacrificing our civil liberties. How many respected community leaders strongly believe in the power of this partnership. And let me go through a list, because I think it's important to put it in the record. Muse Olo, who is highly respected in the Somali American community. Civil rights leader Avel Gordley, a highly respected state senator in Inner Northeast. We've heard today from the Citizens Crime Commission, which is made up of a diverse group of stakeholders. Anti-hate leaders like Randy Blazak and others, and we recently heard from a number of them with our hate resolution at council, but they have spoken up. The Jewish Federation, a broad consortium of law enforcement, state and federal. We've heard from local jurisdictions. We got letters recently from both the mayors of Gresham and, I believe, Hillsborough. The Oregon State Police, which reports to the governor, so their participation in the JTTF has at least the implicit consent of the governor. I could go on with respected members of our community who have a respectful disagreement with your view on this, and who also speak for significant parts of our community. In light of that, what is your objection to seeing, to moving past a binary choice, all in or all out, and instead, like Oakland, but frankly, like some other progressive cities, because we are in good company with progressive cities around the country, with progressive councils that have grappled with this, why not be the jurisdiction that improves and strengthens the relationship so that we can say proudly that we're both safer, which I believe our participation it clearly demonstrates, but that we also are faithful to our tradition of civil liberties?
Thank you, Commissioner Fish. I'm going to take the second part of your question. I think we've been there before. This has been, again, a decade and a half conversation that we've been engaged in the JTTF. And I don't believe, to that my knowledge, that we ever get a clear answer to how we can get involved with transparency. So that's the one portion of it. The second piece about the disagreement of the other community leaders that you mentioned. Good people make bad judgments sometimes. We can disagree. It doesn't mean that we have to be moving forward together in a ways that bend one group to another group. And like, for example, Musa Olol. I have highly respect for Musa Olol, but him and I are completely in disagreement on this issue. Majority of the Somali community that I speak and I talk to them are absolutely terrified the JTTF involvement in the city of Portland. Lastly, even if we follow by the book and we have a clear line of division and we follow the law, here is the final point I'm going to make. Just sending the message, the values that we are involved in the federal JTTF program. Send us the clear message in our community, particularly those who are underrepresented, that we are not valuing their civil rights. By withdrawing, it ensures them to understand that the city of Portland cares their civil rights. And that is the fundamental value that we have to live up to as a Portlanders.
Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. You get the last word. I want to thank all of our panelists for what I think was a fantastic discussion. Thank you all for being here and answer our questions. Thank you, Chief Outlaw and Officers Brian and Mike, for joining us on the phone. Tomorrow we'll be taking this up in council. We'll hear public testimony. We'll take up a decision about whether to stay in the Joint Terrorism Task Force or not. Either way, we will also be discussing what our partnership with the FBI looks like going forward. So thank you all for participating. We are adjourned.